In the previous video, we looked at the term Hei Gui. The term Gui, ghost or devil, is used in other racist insults too, such as日本 Gui, generally translated as jab or nib, and Yang Gui, generally translated as foreign devil. Although what is in mind here are Western devils, particularly whites. In Taiwan, Yang Gui or Yang Guizi has fallen into disuse. The last time I can remember being called a Yang Gui was in about 1994, and the only people who ever did use that name to refer to me were first-generation mainland Chinese immigrants. It seems that this particular name was never carried over to the second generation. However, a variation is still in incredibly widespread use in Hong Kong, and that is Gui Lao, pronounced Guilo, which simply means ghost fellow or devil fellow. Most Chinese, and even many non-Chinese in the territory, assert that this term is not insulting. I believe this is because, for Chinese, they're not at the receiving end. When I asked a number of local people I knew when I lived there if they would consider Hong Kong devil to be harmless or to be derogatory, every single one of them told me they felt the term was derogatory. I also found that some of the local expat population in Hong Kong actually believed they were being called Guilo because to Chinese they seemed white as a ghost. This is way off the mark. The concept of a ghost being white, as if covered by a shroud, is entirely Western in origin. The real reason Caucasians came to be called Yang Gui is because Chinese people felt they looked like evil spirits. Here's an artist's impression of a Yang Gui, drawn in 1840. Notice the fur and the beak. As for the beak, we'll come back to that later. Most terms that use the character Gui are essentially negative. For example, Gui Hua means lies. Gui Guai are monsters. A Jiu Gui is an alcoholic, and a Si Gui is a sex fiend. And of course, Gui Lian is a grimace, an ugly face, literally a face like a ghost or devil. And that's what people in China had in mind when the first Yang Gui appeared on the China coast, the colonizing Portuguese and later British. Nothing at all to do with white shrouds and the like. In Chinese folk belief, there are basically two kinds of spirit, good and bad. Shen, which are good spirits, sometimes translated simply as spirits, but usually translated as gods on the one hand, and Gui on the other, which are evil, malevolent, and usually hideous looking. Here's an example of a god, the god of wealth, and you've already seen an example of a Gui, the furry three-fingered creature or being with the beak. In ancient times, a part of modern China was once known as Shenzhou, or Divine Province, and this later came to be another term for China. Can you imagine that there could be any confusion between Shen and Gui to the Chinese mind? It's a ridiculous idea. So, generally speaking, any name which includes the character Gui, like Hei Gui, Yang Gui, 日本 Gui, or Gui Lao, is by its very nature an insult. Now let's move on to another term, often used in conjunction with Gui, and that is Fan or barbarian. This term basically applies to all people who are not Chinese. And during Qing Dynasty rule, including in Taiwan, it was an official term, including for the Taiwan Aboriginals, who later came to be known as Mountain Compatriots, and finally, only in 1994, as Indigenous Taiwanese. Today, this term has fallen into disuse in most Chinese societies, with the notable exception of Hong Kong, where the term Fanlo, barbarian fellow, is still in very widespread use, and often used along with Guilo to make Fan Guilo, a barbarian devil fellow. When I lived in Hong Kong in the 1990s, I was called Fanlo by my neighbours on a daily basis. Okay, back to Taiwan, where the most common term by far for a Caucasian is the Taiwanese adoa, which can be roughly translated as old beaky. The meaning of beaky may not seem obvious in English, unless written, so alternatively old beak nose, or just old hook nose, old big nose, old nosy. See what you feel comfortable with. I prefer to stay close to the actual meaning of the character used, which is beak, so that's the term I'll use for the rest of this video and any further videos I use this name in. To be fair, many people, including many native Taiwanese, do not realize exactly what character is used in this term and how offensive it is. This is because a variety of different characters, including Mandarin transliterations, are typically used in writing the same sound, but the correct character is the one which means beak. But even if adoa is translated simply as nosy or big nose, it's difficult to see how it could be anything but negative. Some Taiwanese will claim that a protruding nose is admired. But by the same token, English speakers could claim that slanted eyes are beautiful, mysterious, and enchanting. But the terms slant and slant eye are regarded as racial slurs in English. At the end of the day, even if a name has no racial connotation, like fatso or skinny, it can only be regarded as not insulting by the target of the insult or compliment. The person doing the name calling can't decide on other people's behalf whether or not it's insulting. So, who uses this name, adoa or old beaky then? I would say, on average, about 3/4 of the native Minnan or Taiwanese-speaking population use this term, and in fact they are unlikely to use any other when referring to Caucasians in Taiwanese. That would be just over half the total population of Taiwan. But this is one of those terms like oji-san or oba-san, which were originally Japanese, that have come to be used so much by all native Taiwanese speakers that it can be safely said that all people in Taiwan are familiar with it. In the neighborhood where I live, for example, many of my neighbors and other people I know, who know my name and use my name when speaking to me, will still prefer to call me adoa when referring to me among themselves. Anyway, whether regarded as a compliment, an insult, or anything between, this is a term which is in such widespread use that it's very unlikely to disappear anytime soon, probably not within the next 2 or 3 decades. So if you're planning on staying in Taiwan long term, I would just get used to it. Finally, I'd like to finish off this second video in the series with something I often experience in my first 10 years or so in Taiwan, which I think is now uncommon. And that's a kind of indirect insult. Or indirect for me at least, very direct from my girlfriend. So it's an insult in which the Chinese partner in a mixed couple is insulted, especially if the Chinese partner is female. Why mention it if it doesn't happen much anymore? Well, I heard from various sources that this is still very common in some parts of the PRC. And many foreign nationals who come to Taiwan to study Mandarin, or to work here for a year or two, end up spending some time traveling around mainland China. So, in this approach, somebody, usually a complete stranger, will ask, "Why are you with a foreigner? Chinese not good enough for you?" The more severe version is to simply throw an insult like 下流 at the Chinese female. 下流 means low life, but if there's a sexual connotation, it's usually translated as slut. If you get the impression that things are much better in Taiwan in this respect now than they were a few decades ago, you're absolutely right. Or at least that's my impression too. Well, that just about wraps up this second video, and I think just one more is needed to finish with this subject. Thanks for watching or listening.